Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to this interview series. My name is Phillip Ralph, and on this channel we're all about influence, impact and making a difference for you as a leader and manager. And today I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you a very good friend, an old colleague of mine, old not so much chronologically, Pete, but I think we met in the early 2000s, so what, about 15, 17 years ago. So I'd like to welcome Pete Jensen. Hi, Pete.
Hi, Phil. Thank you very much for having me.
That's all right. So today I just invited Pete along to invited you along, Pete, to talk about, for me, is a really, really important topic and one that I'm hearing a lot about. And I thought it was worthwhile getting you into interview as a thought leader. And that is the notion of psychological safety. And I talk with my own clients and the organisations I work with about this, but I know you have really delved much deeper into this and have really made it a, kind of an area of expertise for you. So I'm really keen to find out, your thoughts on psychological safety and, really having a great conversation about it.
Oh, thank you. And I'm delighted to spend some time with my good friend. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. It does feel like old times, doesn't it? So just for those watching, just so you know how Pete and I connected was through the ANZ Breakout program. And so when I was there as the head of consulting and program delivery, Pete was one of the wonderful facilitators and coaches we recruited as an associate. Such a big program, Pete, that we needed, I think it was about 70 associates we had and about 20 full-time internal people to try and service 45 countries and 45,000 people.
Yeah, indeed it was. And what a great program it was.
All right, well, let's launch into it. So psychological safety, but before we do, I'd love to hear, just for the folks listening, just if you could maybe overview, your background and how did you come to this point to be working in this field?
Well, thanks, Phil. Without going through my missionary upbringing on the farms of Africa, but having been in Australia for the last 20 years, I've been working in three key areas. One is leadership, and being responsible for running some very big leadership programs for organizations like BHP. Culture, as you mentioned earlier, one of the great projects was the ANZ Breakout Culture Transformation Program. And in the past 6 or 7 years, my focus has really been honed in two areas. One is as a keynote speaker on the topic of happiness. I wrote a book on that. But transferring that to the work on a day-to-day basis, I keep having the same questions asked, and it's around psychological safety in the workplace. So we live in a world at the moment where, the Gallup poll tells us that 82% of Australians are unhappy at work, and it's costing the country $31.5 billion. When you look at the health and safety profession, currently mental stress claims have overtaken physical injury claims. So there's certainly something going on, and the more I interact with senior leaders and organizations and people just doing the job, it's the same theme that keeps recurring. So I have honed my practice really in on helping leaders actually understand and demystify this whole notion of psychological safety into something practical and give them the tools they can take away. Yeah.
Fantastic. So that's probably a good place to start, Pete. And what is this thing called psychological safety in your view?
Well, Phil, I'd like to go back just one step, if I can. And a question that I often put to groups that I address is, if you distill everything from leadership and culture and innovation and continuous improvement and everything that we do down to a very simple question, which is, what makes people happy at work? There are two answers to that question. One comes from Alain, who we all know, and who's involved in the School of Life here in Melbourne. And the other is the Chief Happiness Officer, in fact, a guy called Alex Kjerulf in Denmark. And with my parents being Danish, I've had a lot of interaction with Alex. And in fact, in Denmark, Phil, they have a word for this. They call it arbejdsglæde, which in English means the joy of work. So Alex will often pose the question, what are the two things that make people happy at work? And his answer is the same as Alain de Botton's, which is results and relationships. And if we really think about it, as the individual in the context of the organization, results are important. We want to kick goals. We want to perform. We want to have a framework we can learn and grow as people. So results are important. but equally important are relationships. And relationships are broken into those you have with yourself, so how you manage life or how you do life, and then the relationships that you have with others as well. And what fascinates me often is the focus of organizations is very heavily steeped towards the results side of the equation. We'll do whatever we can, throw whatever resources we have to make sure we achieve results, but how often do we actually look at the relationship side, whether either as individuals or how people interact with each other. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we get more into the topic of psychological safety.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? The very thing that we pursue in organisations being results is actually the antithesis of long-term results. That if we focus too heavily on results and take our eye off the people, the culture, engagement, psychological safety, then the results will be short-term at best, yeah?
Yeah, and you look at cyclical upswings in organisations. When things are going well, then we don't really worry too much about results. We don't worry too much about resilience. We don't worry too much about people's mental health. But when the proverbial hits the fan and the results start slowing down, if we don't have a very solid foundation around relationships, which are how people manage their own life, but also how they interact, then that's often when things fall through the crack. And it's kind of perceived to be an add-on. And I think that to me is, I guess, a lead into demystifying what this whole notion of psychological safety is. And you always know me to be a little outspoken, and I have been on this topic as well. Fortunately, I straddle both culture and safety. And when I look at psychological safety, I truly believe that it's been lost in what I call a fog of well-being incentives. And what I mean by that is that although these incentives are all well-meant and well-intended, so an organisation will have an employee assistance program, will have a mental health first aid kit, will have a whole lot of incentives in place, they're still not hitting the mark because they've been implemented as a bolt-on or as an ad hoc kind of strategy. In fact, I'm not alone in this. The New York Times ran a story a few years ago, and the quote was, "We're spending 69% more per person on well-being incentives, but people aren't getting well." And it begs the question as to why is that? And I truly believe that an organisation needs a robust framework around this and needs to understand it.
Yeah.
So for me, psychological safety is far beyond just meeting compliance requirements or having a couple of nice to haves. It's what are we really doing as an organisation? And we need to understand that we're operating in a new world. Technology, as wonderful as it is, I have a 91-year-old dad in Denmark, and we Skype once a week, and that's fantastic, and I really love the functionality and the power, the enabling power of technology. But when we look into the results side of the equation, could it be that technology is also causing isolation and separation in the workplace? And the story to share is I know of somebody who worked in an IT company in Melbourne. She was a project manager. They had a Christmas party, and I said, "Wow, that's fantastic! Christmas party, free booze, the whole thing that goes with it." And she turned around and said, "I'm not going." And I said, "You got to be crazy! You're a manager. Surely you'd be going to your own company Christmas party." And her answer was, "Well, actually, no, I'm not going because my team's not going." To which I replied, "Well, because you're a manager, surely you have meaningful relationships with other people on your floor. There are 100 people." She just looked at me blankly and stared and said, no, I don't. And that shocked me. So I asked the obvious question as to, well, why is that? And she said, "Pete, I come into work every day. Everyone has earphones in their ears. They're huddled over their computers. I go to my pod in the open plan, and I work with my team, and then I go home. No, I don't have meaningful relationships," which I found really sad. A few months later, we caught up, and I said, how are things? And she said, over Christmas, one of the people on my floor was actually killed in a car accident. And then she said these horrifying words. She said, "I've been working here for 4 years. I don't even know what he looks like."
Wow.
And I said to her, "Well, what could you do? A typical coach?" And she said, "You know what? I'm going to take 5 minutes every day to go and meet somebody new on my floor." Phil, it took a fatality to have that realization, but it really is a bit of a mirror for, I think, what is happening a lot in the workplace is we've lost the sense of belonging, we've lost the sense of connection. We're all time poor and technology rich. In the old days, we'd hang around and have a few beers and we'd find out what was going on in our marriages, our lives, our finances, our mortgages. But today, and if you look at the whole notion of borderless offices where, I think it's fantastic that people can work from home and that keeps less cars on the freeways and you can pick up your kids after school. But how do you build that social peer support when you're always working remotely? How do you build trust on a conference call? So as leaders, there's this balance that we need to have around managing psychological safety. So, look, I think one of the best places to start is to define psychological safety. And there are a number of different reasons. If you
boil it all down to it, what is psychological safety in a few words?
Well, look, knowing how you're such a stickler for detail, I did my homework.
Is that right?
And no, there is I guess the world benchmark right now is the Canadian standard of 2013. And it was put together by a lot of thought leaders across industry in consultation with workers. And whilst it's a voluntary standard, it certainly sends the benchmark. And what I took from their definition around psychological safety, and I will have a glance at a piece of paper to make sure I read it right, is it's about the organization actively working to prevent harm to workers' psychological health. And it continues to say, and promotes psychological well-being. But the key word in there is actively, not just having a few things, but actively working hard. Now, that's a standard that people, and I'm happy to leave you the link at the end of this talk to the actual 38-page document so people can reference that. If we look a little closer in Australia, psychological safety has now been included as part of our duty of care. And there have already been prosecutions in that space around mental stress, for example, where a manager was convicted and fined because one of his team went off with a mental stress claim. And if one delves into the Act, there are actually 13 key elements of a psychosocial risk management system. So from a compliance perspective, this has been outlined around these 13 key elements. And again, the Act at this stage is it's up to employers or organizations to decide or to make their own decisions.
Okay.
For me, there is, of course, the compliance side, but I actually look at it from a leadership perspective and a moral responsibility as well. And the two most common phrases I hear, when I go and speak with teams or senior leadership teams are the following. The first phrase is, I wish I could say what I really think, but I won't. And then the second comment that follows that is, if only they really knew me, or if only they really understood me. And a leader in the field of psychological safety is Edmundson, who recently did a TED talk on workplace silence. And again, her definition, and I'll read it to you, is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And so for me, this really starts to ring around things like, I have a fear of being vulnerable. I don't think I can say what I really think. I have a fear of being judged. And she calls this workplace silence. So once we start looking at different definitions, for me personally, my definition of psychological safety is a place where people feel mentally and emotionally safe, where there are specific policies to support and enable this that are actively embedded, which really links in with the Canadian definition, and where leaders lead with both care and consequence, but there is an accountability as well of people. So to me, psychological safety is really made up of three things. I believe that we need to create a culture that is psychologically safe, and that is a leader responsibility, leading with care and consequence. But the second part of this is that employees have a part to play in this as well. We sign up for a job, and I call this being psychologically fit. We sign up for a job, and as part of that, we need to be fit for work. Now, historically, we've had, drug testing and alcohol testing. But when you start thinking about what's happening in the world today, and again, the stats would bear me out, but 25% of Australians are either on medication or seeing a physician for depression, stress, or anxiety. And then you add to that just the pressures of doing life. Mortgage stress, relationship issues, substance dependency, whatever your substance may be, sleep deprivation. All these things combined, how do they impact my ability to perform the role that I'm being paid for? And do I have the
pretty confronting stats, aren't they, really?
Yeah, and do I have the skills to manage that? And then the third element of psychological safety is, first of all, we need to create a psychologically safe culture. We need to help our people, because I think that leaders are realizing that people don't have the skills to be psychologically fit. So what can we do to do a gap analysis, understand where the gaps are, and actually provide them with the tools? And the third thing is psychologically thriving. These are teams where people are willing to feel vulnerable, where people are willing to admit mistakes, and where they actually thrive in that environment. So I guess at a higher level, those are definitions based on the Canadian standard, the Work Health Safety Act, thought leaders like Alain Edmundson, and I've kind of collated that into my own view.
Yeah, I really like that, Pete, and thanks so much for such a comprehensive overview. I only recently watched that TED Talk by Alain Edmundson, actually, and I really like the way she thinks about psychological safety, and I know she does a lot of work in healthcare. So for those who don't know, a Harvard professor, Harvard Business School. And for me, I work in healthcare a lot as well. And I think in healthcare particularly, or whether it be law enforcement or whatever those kind of high critical, high stress jobs, the psychological safety becomes even more important, doesn't it? If you're being operated on by a surgeon, you want a nurse or a junior surgeon to feel safe enough to speak up and say, you're about to undertake wrong side surgery. We're supposed to be operating on the left side, not the right side, for example.
Yeah. Look, I think it meets two things. One is obviously the results that we're responsible for, back to the original point, but also the relationships are so critical on a day-to-day basis, because as human beings, we have a need. We have a need to belong. We have a need to actually be psychologically fit. And I think the challenge that most leaders face, and the Canadian document says this very much, leaders are now wearing a very heavy burden around this, because on the one hand, there's the legal obligation, and I'm not going to go into that, but these are all the negatives. And if you look at costs at the moment, the cost of an average physical injury, according to ComCare, is $48,000. The cost of a mental health injury or a mental stress claim is $191,000. So there'd be all the commercial drivers, be it legal compliance or be it reducing your work cover insurance premiums. But on the flip side, I think as leaders, we also have a moral responsibility towards the people that we lead.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the great examples here would be Google. They published some research a few years ago. I think they interviewed 1,300 people, and what they came back with in the research was an apology, an admission. They said, we thought if we got the best skill sets and we assembled those in teams, we'd have a winning culture. What we've realized is that it all starts with, and they have now popularized the word, the building block is psychological safety. They've also realized that they can't rely on their people to be psychologically fit. So they engage them in programs like the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, where people learn the skills to manage themselves. And a classic quote was a Google staffer who said, I always thought that the best way to manage stress, or my strategy, used to be bourbon and cheeseburgers, but now it's mindful. And to me, that's just a development within that individual. But I think from a responsibility perspective, we cannot leave it to our employees and teammates to have all the skills to manage all the things they have to deal with. What can we as leaders do to help them heal them up?
So, Pete, I guess at a really basic level for people listening and watching this video, it sounds like, for me, and I agree with everything you're saying, that at the most fundamental level, it's about people being able to turn up to work and say things that are on their minds, or do things in a constructive way without fear of retribution or being embarrassed or being called out, in a negative way, as most fundamental level,
Well, that's the first part of it. I think when people then feel safe to be vulnerable and speak about what's really going on for them is important. And the third thing, which to me is quite critical, is how we look out for each other. So if I notice some early warning signs in a colleague, I'm not a psychologist. How do I deal with that? What should I do? And, again, this whole notion, coming back to the story earlier about isolation in the workplace, is the notion of social support. And again, drawing on leaders in the field, Patrick Hudson is kind of known as the father or the guru of safety culture evolution. And he talks about organizations that are generative, and I quote, he says, there's no work for the leaders because peers take care of the safety of peers. So it's very much I'm looking after my mate. On the flip side, you have Sean Acker at Harvard University, who you said he came out in a white paper and said, we put warning labels on cigarette packaging. We should put the same warning labels on companies. We are hurting people. And then he continues.
Yes.
He says this is not a role for the leaders. It's about turning on team members onto the benefits they receive from providing social support to each other. So we have the kind of safety experts and the leadership experts both talking about the importance of leaders creating context and purpose, and the reason why it's important for peers to look out for each other. And of course, if we're looking out for each other, then we'll pick up a lot of the early warning signs. I don't think every employee is going to volunteer what's happening for them, but we've lost that sense again of community and social support in the workplace. So part of this is the leader. The next step is enabling the people, to do that.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm thinking we probably should move to the how. So what are leaders and organisations doing now? So I think the business case is really strong. The moral case is really strong. But for managers and leaders listening to this now, what's best practice? I guess, how do we make it happen?
Look, there are a couple of things, and this really is all about creating a learning culture. And I'll come back to the point of a learning culture in a moment. Learning culture is not about sending people on skills training or knowledge training. It's about a whole lot more than that. So let's take a look at it. What are the 4 critical success factors from an organizational perspective? So Erik Hollnagel, who is well known for his work in resilience engineering, talks about how organizations respond to external stress. And let's be honest, this is the kind of workplace that we live in. We have a lot of external stress, and he identifies 4 critical behaviors of an organization. 1 is how it responds. 2 is how it monitors stress. 3 is how it learns. And then 4 is how it anticipates. And so a key part of Erik Hollnagel's work is around resilience engineering, but in particular around how we learn as an organization. When we look at an example around individual success, we need to look no further than an organization called Zappo, and a lot has been written about Zappo. The CEO wrote a fantastic book, which I recommend as well. But they are an organization, for those who haven't heard of Zappo, that grew from 1.8 million to a 1.8 billion turnover in just 4 years. Constantly in the top 10 of best companies to work for. And they've identified 4 critical success factors for their team members. And it's the measure of an individual's perceived control and perceived progress. Now, I look at those 2, and I look at results, the 2 things that make people happy at work, and those certainly relate to results. But they also then look at 2 other factors, which is the measure of an individual's level of connection and having a meaningful vision, which to me really then comes back to the relationships piece. So from their perspective at Zappo's, they have systematized many things. When you go through your induction process, that takes 6 weeks. Think about that for a moment. 6 weeks. And during that process, you actually assigned a happiness coach, which may sound a little bit off the scale for your leaders, but the whole point of that is the sense making. I mean, why am I actually here at work? I'm here to earn money. Why is that important? Because I need to pay off my mortgage. Why is that important? Because I want to have a happy retirement. Whatever the reason might be, it all comes down to one thing. I'm actually at work because I want to be happy, and that's what they do right at the start. And at the end of the 6 weeks, if staff don't fit their culture, they actually pay them money to leave. So there's something radical for the radicals in the audience. The other thing around Zappos, which is really important around perceived progress and around perceived control, is that you earn pay rises by acquiring more skill sets. It's not enforced. Different people have got different choices, but they recognize this whole results, the learning, the growth is a really important thing. So they actually attach meaning to that, where in the old days, it might take 18 months to get a rise in your pay grade. They've reduced that into 12 1.5-month little blocks. So as you perceive progress, so it impacts your pay grade as well. So they've kind of understood this whole results and relationships that I spoke to about earlier, that are critical. It's that important to them that they've actually systematized the social support we were speaking about earlier. The example of, somebody on my floor was killed. I have no idea what they look like because, I don't have relationships at work. If you go to Zappo's, they've understood how the world is changing. So they have KPIs around this. Every manager must spend 20% of his time talking to employees about non-work related issues. I don't know if you recall the time we had managers who knew our kids' names, who knew our birthdays, who understood what was happening in our lives. And the kicker is that every employee must spend 10% of their time talking to employees in other departments. So they've actually systematized this whole notion of we need to be connected and support. And if someone doesn't meet their KPIs, they don't get punished. They get coached around that. They've recognized the new age that we live in, so they use technology to their advantage, and they encourage the use of social media during working hours. So, Phil, if you're into mountain biking, for example, they go, well, start a Twitter account, start a Facebook group. Let's see who else in the company's into mountain, and take some time, guys, and connect around something that's meaningful to you. So I think for me, it's kind of starting to understand, the whole notion of what's important in terms of success organizationally. Anna Edmundson, who you referred to earlier, she frames this wonderfully, where she talks about the perceived tension between psychological safety on the one hand and accountability for results on the other. And she asked the question of, are these opposed to each other? Are we going to be too warm and fluffy and not make the numbers, or is it all about the numbers and we're losing people? And her response is that they're not actually diametrically opposed. They're actually independent of each other. And her analogy is pretty simply driving a car, you have a brake and an accelerator. But the important thing is, if you could imagine for a moment just a graphic, on the vertical you've got psychological safety, on the horizontal you've got accountability for results. If someone's low in both, then we have what she calls the apathy zone. We don't want to go there. Somebody who is high on psychological safety but low on accountability of results, she calls that the comfort zone. And let's be honest, it's all nice to hang around, but we're not growing, we're not learning, which to me relates to stress. As you know, there are two forms of stress. There's distress, but eustress is that stress of I'm not being stretched enough, and then people get bored and they leave. On the flip side, if it's all about accountability for results with no regard for psychological safety, she calls that the anxiety zone, which correlates quite strongly with all the data that's coming out of the workplace in the moment around anxiety and mental stress. The ideal place is where you're doing both, and she calls that the learning zone. So we've got Anna Edmundson talking about learning. We've got Erik Hollnagel talking about learning. Here's my question. How can people learn if they feel that they're not allowed to make mistakes? If they feel like they're not allowed to share their anxieties or their fears, etc.? So all of a sudden, learning is the ideal, but when we translate that to interpersonal relationships, well, how can you have a learning zone in that environment? And the Harvard Business Review...
By default, you really can't, can you? Because learning is about pushing one's limits and growing and making mistakes. So, Pete, we're just about out of time. I feel like we've only really just touched the surface in 30 minutes.
Sorry, I do ramble on a little bit, as you know.
No, not at all. But it just, for me, this has just highlighted the depth of this as a topic and how valuable it is for managers and leaders. And just to finish off on Edmundson, one of the things I really like about her, we often frame a lack of psychological safety and mistakes as execution, where she says we should reframe it as learning, which I really, really like. It's not an execution error, it's a learning error. We need to learn from it, which I really love.
Well, Phil, look, I do want to stretch I was going to just stretch our friendship one little extra inch, because the point that you just made, and it's a wrap-up of the learning piece as framed by Anna, but the Harvard Business Review ran an article in 2014 where they talk about deliberately developmental organizations. These are organizations where and the tagline is turning employees' struggles into growth opportunities, which underlines our frame here around learning. And there they have teams where it's expected to show vulnerability. It's expected to talk about your mistakes. It's expected to talk about your shortcomings. if you're not doing that, one of your peers will actually tap you on the shoulder. And a beautiful quote, which I think sums up everything we've spoken about, is one of the staffers at Ducure & Associates said, if people must feel vulnerable in order to grow, then there is a need for a community that'll make them feel safe. And I guess that to me is the essence of psychological safety.
Fantastic. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, I really love that quote. Actually, it's a really nice summary about what it's about. And it comes back to that notion of tribe and caring for one another at its most basic level. So, Pete, in terms of wrapping up, how do people find out about you? How do they connect with you?
Look, there are a couple of ways. I do have a website. So one of my businesses is larsenjensen.com. So LARSEN and then Jensen, JENSEN.com.
And we'll put that in the link below. Yep.
That would be great. And Pete.Jensen at that email address. I do a lot of speaking on this topic as well, and I have a few speaking engagements coming up.
Fantastic.
And naturally through your organisation as well, Phil.
Fantastic. And what I understand you may actually have a couple of gifts for people who have listened to us right to the end. So can you just very briefly talk about the two gifts we have for people, which I think are huge value adds actually?
Yeah, look, Phil, this is part of my passion. I keep encountering so many people that are struggling in the workplace, and so anything I can do to make a difference. The first one is it's a complementary psychological assessment tool. So that looks at the areas I spoke about, psychologically safe, fit and thriving, and then adds a dimension of work-life balance. So if anyone listening to this wants to run that through their own team or reflect on their organization, then that's available in soft copy. And the second thing is an ebook that I actually wrote about the 7 common mistakes that leaders make when it comes to psychological safety. And that ebook will take what I've shared with you in this short time and expand on it. So there's a lot more detail and some tools in there as well.
Thanks, Pete. And that's a very generous offer, and I'm sure people watching and listening will really appreciate that. And again, we'll put the links in the description below. So if you're listening, check out the links and you can get access to both of those complimentary, very generous gifts. So thanks very much, Pete. I think it's been fantastic. I think it's such an interesting area. And for me, it's at the heart of management and leadership and creating high-performing, healthy, thriving organisations where people feel safe, they come to work and do their best work, and they go home and talk in a really positive way about what happened at work today. And for me, that's just so important. So I want to thank you for your time again, Pete. And I might just leave the very last word to you to sign off before we close off.
Thanks very much, Phil. I think what we've spoken about a little bit today is the what, and the struggle that most leaders have is the how. You know, from a legal perspective, the question is, what did you do and did you do enough? Morally, I think leaders are going, well, we know there's an issue here, but it's really about the how. And that's where I've really focused my practice on, is enabling leaders with the tools and a framework that meets the requirements, but more importantly, can empower their people. So So thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Pete, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you, Phil. Bye-bye.